I'm Caroline Howitt, Programme Director here at Adam Smith's Panmure House, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you, those of you who are here today, and indeed those of you who are joining us online, to our chair for this afternoon's Panmure House Prize results session. Professor Sir John Kay is one of Britain's leading economists. His career spans the worlds of academia, business, finance, and public affairs. He's held chairs at the London Business School, the University of Oxford, and the London School of Economics, and he's now a fellow at St John's College, Oxford, where he began his academic career in 1970. He's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Sir John is a director of several public companies and a contributing editor of the Financial Times. He chaired the 2012 review of UK equity markets and long-term decision-making, which, among other things, means he's particularly well placed to be a judge on the Panmure House Prize panel. He's the author of many books, including The Truth About Markets, The Long and Short of It, and Obliquity. His 2015 work, entitled Other People's Money, was Book of the Year for Bloomberg, The Economist, and the Financial Times. It was also winner of the Saltire Literary Prize for Non-Fiction and was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. His latest book, Greed is Dead, was published in July 2020. We are enormously privileged to have him with us today, and so with that, please now join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Sir John Kay.
Well, thank you all for joining us in Panmure House, and those of you who are joining us online. The primary purpose of this afternoon is to hear Rachelle Sampson talk about her research, which she's undertaken as the inaugural winner of the Panmure House Prize. Professor Sampson comes from the University of Maryland, and I'll be introducing her in a bit more detail in a moment. Because before I want to welcome Rachelle, I'd like to provide some introduction to why we're here this afternoon. We're here in Panmure House, which is named for the Earls of Panmure, who built it in the late 17th century. But the most famous resident, of course, was Adam Smith, universally regarded as the father of economics as a result of his great 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith lived here from 1778 to 1790 when he died. So the last years of Smith's life were spent here. These 12 years when Smith was here were part of the great Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, when the thinkers who were around here in Edinburgh at the time changed not only Scotland, but far more the world. It was a great moment in Scottish history, one I think we need to do far more to celebrate. But literally in this room, catered no doubt by the long-suffering Adam Smith's mother, Mrs. Smith, whom you can see on the wall behind us, the luminaries of Edinburgh were greeted here by Adam and his mother, and engaged in conversation on the great issues of the day. Panmure House had become derelict, but it was bought in 2008 by Edinburgh Business School, Heriot-Watt University, and restored over the following 10 years to be once again a centre of thought and discussion. And we hope, and I know everyone here hopes, that it can once again be a centre of debate and discussion on pressing issues of the day. And it has already become so. It's a short time since it was reopened, and we greeted for a conference entitled The New Enlightenment, scholars from all around the world to talk about the pressing issues. If Smith had been around today, what would he have been talking about? Well, I only have to formulate that question for you to know that it's ludicrous. Smith lived in a world which was massively different from the one we're used to. Smith's defining idea was probably the division of labor, that people could be more productive if they reduced production to a series of specialist functions undertaken by different people. Smith could never have imagined the degree to which the division of labor would today be taken, that we would be sourcing products from around the world. We would create a world in which there was nobody at all in the world who knew how to build an Airbus, but 10,000 people taken together do. But what we've learned in the last 3 or 4 years has been that that world of the division of labor is much more fragile than people had been ready to imagine. We need to construct supply chains that are robust and resilient. And in the last half century, people in business have tended to regard robustness and resilience not as insurance against unexpected contingencies, but against measures of inefficiency and redundancy. And I imagine if people of the caliber of Smith and his contemporaries were meeting in this house today, these are the issues which they would be discussing. And I hope that we will be able in Panmure House to gather people approaching at least that kind of distinction to gather and resolve these issues. I hope also that Smith's legacy will be taken forward in an appropriate way. One of the extraordinary things about Adam Smith is the degree to which he's admired by people who have read, if more than a word of his work, only a few words of his work. The reference is to invisible hand, the reference is to not from benevolence, the belief that what Smith said was that people should be encouraged to be as greedy as possible, and that things would work out all for the best if they were. Anyone who knows anything about Smith's work will know that that is not what Smith had to say at all. Smith's 2 great books, The Wealth of Nations and the Moral and Moral Sentiments, Smith's 2 books created an emphasis on sympathy. That was a phrase which was central to the Moral Sentiments. It was the idea that we succeed both morally and economically by cooperation with other people, and by cooperation with other people, which is motivated not just by financial gain, but motivated by genuine concern. And we need to think about what that implies for the ways in which we run our business. But our reason for being here this afternoon is in connection with the Panmure House Prize. The Panmure House Prize is an annual reward of $75,000, and it's made possible by the generosity of Baillie Gifford, the Edinburgh-based asset management firm. And its purpose is to enable emerging leaders in academia to engage in research concerned with long-term investing and its relationship to innovation. The purpose of the prize is not just to encourage academic research, but to encourage academic research which is aimed at illuminating what it is practitioners in business and in the investment community actually do. The opportunity to win the prize is open to early career academics. Their entries are shortlisted by our staff, and they're then judged by a panel, several of whose members are here in the room today. Heather McGregor, Executive Dean of Edinburgh Business School, Sarah Williamson, who is Chief Executive of FCLT Global, and James Anderson, who is Chair of the Panmure House judging panel. Last year's inaugural prize was awarded to a team based at the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, and their proposed research was to investigate whether long-term oriented firms, those that were supported by government-funded R&D, by stronger scientific organization, by more centralized organization, whether they were more likely to produce breakthrough innovations. The team was led by Professor Rachelle Sampson, who was Assistant Professor of Logistics, Business and Public Policy at the Smith School of Business at Maryland, and she's also a visiting scholar at ESG Analytics Lab at Wharton School and a senior policy scholar at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on how organization structure and ownership affects investment, R&D productivity. Rachelle received a PhD from the University of Michigan, having gone there from a law degree at Queensland University of Technology in Australia. She teaches MBA and PhD courses in strategy, managerial economics, ESG, and environmental strategy. The setup for this afternoon is that Rachelle will present her research. We will then have a Q&A session, both for those of you who are in the room and online. So I'd like those of you who are present in the room to join me in welcoming Rachelle to the stage. Rachelle.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all for those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are here online. Let me first also thank Panmure House for the honor and privilege of being the inaugural winner of this prize. It's truly been an honor and just a wonderful experience. So I'm very, very grateful to be here in the former home of Adam Smith. So I'd like to first acknowledge that this research is co-authored. I have a wonderful team of collaborators, Brent Goldfarb from the University of Maryland, Rafael Corredora from Ohio State, and Yuan Shi from Cornell University. So this is joint work that I'm presenting today on the changing nature of firm R&D, right? So how we think short-termism that's rising in US capital markets and in capital markets around the world might be actually affecting the rate and nature of innovation within firms. So I'd like to just start with two basic facts, what we know from research. So the first is that firm research productivity has been flat or declining over time. So we know this from what firms are actually investing, but what they're actually getting out of it. And so there's much research on this. But along with this is we know that firms are not decreasing in their spending on research and development. So we have this flat or declining R&D productivity, and yet we have increased spending on research and development. We also know that firms seem to be, and markets as well, becoming increasingly short-term oriented. And so this is a measure of short-termism, which I'll elaborate a little bit more in the talk. But this is showing how this level of short-termism has been rising. This is in US markets in particular, this particular graph, over time. And that it's also, we see these sharp spikes in this measure following periods of great uncertainty, like the pop of the dot-com bubble, as well as the 2007-2008 financial crisis, which is exactly what we do expect to happen. So what we did is put these things together, these two ideas or empirical facts, and develop the research question that forms the heart of this paper. And that is, how does rising short-termism influence firm innovative output, specifically whether they're producing breakthrough inventions, right? So not just every invention, not incremental inventions, but things that are radical and really change the trajectory of innovation within a particular industry or sector. And so what we do in this research is we measure that relationship between short-termism and these influential inventions to answer this research question. And just to give you a preview of what we find, because this is not a mystery novel, so basically more short-term oriented firms are less likely to patent, to produce patents. And for those that do actually patent, they are less novel, less influential, less likely to have other inventions that build upon them in the future. We also find that this effect varies according to firms. So when firms are engaged in more complex, more detailed, longer-term research projects, what we find is that short-termism has a much greater impact on their research programs, right? And so we capture whether or not they're in these more complex long-term research projects by looking at whether they're in very complex technological fields, whether they have received government funding for their research and development, and this is because government funding typically goes to things like basic research. They have more references in their patents to the scientific literature, so there's more embedding in basic science, and they have more centralized research and development programs within the firms themselves, which is usually also a signal of more basic research within the firms. So we find this, but we also find that this relationship may well be causal, right? So we're not just finding these relationships that correlate with each other, but we're actually finding that rising short-termism is actually driving the drop-off in inventive activity, particularly around influential inventions. And we do this by using alternative measures of short-termism. In this case, we're looking at institutional investor behavior. So institutional investors represent a much bigger proportion of the ownership of firms than they ever have in history. And so when they change their trading behavior, that changes the pressures on the firms. What we find is that that is our instrument for short-termism, and that also can lead to declining influential inventions among firms. So, and this shows very robust similar effects to what we find in our original measure. So the agenda for today is I'd like to just take you through, well, what do we mean by these various terms? So what is a breakthrough invention? And furthermore, perhaps more importantly, what are the conditions that are required in an organization to facilitate or allow a breakthrough invention to occur? And then what does it mean for a firm to be short-term? And furthermore, how are we actually capturing this somewhat nebulous concept? Then we'll talk a little bit about our research design and the empirical results. That is, how are we actually testing these ideas that we're presenting in the research today? What are the implications for business and our economy? And then, of course, we'll open it up for a conversation with Sir John and the audience. And so I look forward to that discussion. So starting off first with what is a breakthrough invention? So very simply, how we are defining it for our purposes is an invention that requires a lot of other sub-technology problems to be solved, right? So it's not just coming up with the one invention, it's coming up with an idea and saying, well, in order to solve that particular problem, there are 9 other problems that I actually need to solve, and we don't have off-the-shelf technologies to solve those. So we have to actually go underneath and now solve all those additional problems as we're trying to solve the larger, more complex issue at hand. So that's how we're defining breakthrough invention. And so let me give you an illustration of this. So believe it or not, this huge machine that takes up most of the room is the first laser printer, the Xerox 9700, right? So some of you may remember, some of you may not, but it was absolutely enormous. So this was invented in large part due to the efforts of Gary Starkweather, who was the inventor. He was originally assigned to the Webster, New York lab for Xerox, and he was focused initially on these existing cathode ray tube machines, right? So that was the existing technology. Was very frustrated there, was fortunately transferred to Xerox PARC, which is organized much more like an academic department. And what that means is more long-term focus, more flexible budget, more flexible in terms of what they could actually examine as researchers within the organization. And so while Starkweather was there, he and his team developed entirely new components, were those sub-technologies that actually enabled the laser printer to be invented. And so this led to the breakthrough 1969 patent that eventually fueled $2 billion in revenues for Xerox PARC when there was an annual Xerox PARC budget at the time of about $6 million. So a pretty decent return. Now, obviously not every project has that kind of payoff, but this is the kind of invention that we're focused on here in our analysis, are these breakthrough ones that really change our economies and change the trajectory for business. Now, what we can learn from this story, right, this anecdote, are some of perhaps what the necessary conditions are for facilitating breakthrough inventions within firms. And so one is that one needs adequate time flexibility to develop these sub-technologies, right, to solve the underlying bigger picture issue. Furthermore, that implies budgetary flexibility, right? Time means money, right? You're paying people for longer periods of time, and so you need sort of a looser leash around capital. Also, a willingness to assume greater uncertainty. There are no guarantees, right, that these long-term projects are actually going to yield some kind of breakthrough valuable invention that's going to lead to a return, right? And so there is uncertainty, and you have to be willing to assume that uncertainty. And so what that implies is that there are longer term payoffs from these projects, right? Now, these breakthrough inventions, apart from what I just mentioned, are more challenging though, because it's very difficult to convey the value to management and capital markets as a researcher due to what we call information asymmetry, right? So someone as the researcher knows much more than me as an outsider, whether I'm in management or as a retail investor, about how they're doing with that technology development, right? And so it's very difficult for them to actually convey that value to me of what they're doing. And then also, success may actually just be too long-term for most managers, right? So we see high turnover, CEOs are turning over more rapidly, but this is also true within the firm with employees. There's much more rapid turnover. And so you may not invest in the long run because you're just simply not going to be there that whole time, right? And your compensation is tied to the short term. So this leads to, of course, our key hypothesis that we're testing empirically in this work, that more short-term oriented firms are much less likely to produce influential inventions. So then turning to the idea of short-termism. So what does it actually mean for a firm to be short-term? You know, we hear this in the common vernacular, it's in the business press quite a bit, there's some cycles around it. But I think this is best illustrated with a simple example, okay? So imagine that we have 3 possible investments with different payoff scenarios. And furthermore, I'm just going to make an assumption about the cost of capital being 9%. It could be more or less than that, we would have the same results, right? So I'm just setting a particular number. We have investment costs, we'll have the cash flows, the cumulative cash flows or the entire life of the investment, which in this case is 10 years, a net present value, so we're discounting that back to the present term, those cash flows, and then a ranking of the investment, like which one would we prefer? Right? Okay, so investment A has an investment cost of 60. The payoff is $28 per annum, years 6 through 10. So nothing in those first 5 years of the investment, but all later. The cumulative cash flow is just simply adding these things up. And then if we were to discount back using that 9% cost of capital, we would get that $70.78, right, for sort of the value in the present period. Then we have a second investment, same cost. Instead, what it's presenting is $10 per annum in terms of return. So it's consistent over the entire life of the investment, all 10 years. That gives us $100 cumulative cash flow for net present value of $64 roughly. And then finally, the last example, again, same investment cost, right? But here we have the payoff in the first 5 years of the investment, $16 per annum, years 1 through 5. The cumulative cash flow over the entire life of the returns is $80, right? But if we discount that back, that's $62 with that weighted average cost of capital of 9%. And what we would see is if we were going to rank these just according to the net present value, which is typically how investment or money allocations are made within firms to different projects, we would find that A is the preferred investment, right? And this is because essentially, you know, the net present value is the highest, but we also see that it has the highest cumulative cash flow. Let's change the assumptions slightly. So now let's add an additional discount factor, right? Another implied discount rate, which I'll talk more about in a moment, of 0.95. And so this effectively operates as an increasing discount on those future cash flows. That means we value those future cash flows even less than before than we do now, right? So now what we see is there's a new net present value calculation, right? Adding this additional discount, and you can see the ranking has reversed. Now we would prefer the third investment, right? So investment C, even though in terms of cumulative cash flow, it pays out less than the other 2 investments. So this is a fairly simplistic example, but it really illustrates what's happening here under the hood when we are thinking about short-termism. It's really about how much are you discounting the future and instead focusing on the present returns. And how does that influence the investment decisions that are made by firms, right? Are they investing in longer-term projects or shorter-term projects? So you can see here the sort of direct links between the cost of capital or the discount rates that are being used by firms and how that influences the very investment decisions that they're making, right? And the choices and priorities that they're setting. Okay, so how do we actually capture this, right? So most firms aren't going to willingly hand over their internal rates of return or their hurdle rates for investment, though we can speculate on some of them. So what we do is we come up with an estimate that is basically, we take the firm's stock price And we estimate that as a function of expected future cash flows and the future sale price of the firm's stock, all discounted back by the usual suspects when we discount firm future cash flows, which includes things that are specific to what company is engaged in, what we might call a company-specific risk premium, as well as the risk-free rates of return. So that's like what you get if you slap your money in a bank account, right? So all of those things are discounting back, and we add an additional factor of this implied discount, or X, as it shows on here. All the details are in the paper if you are so inclined to dig in. But this is actually based on some research that came from Andrew Haldane at the Bank of England and his colleagues, which was built on earlier research. And so what we're doing is we're taking this and applying it to estimate it at the firm level, right? So we're estimating this particular parameter there. And so what we find, this is the average value of this. So rising, bigger numbers mean more short-termism as we've constructed this measure. And so what this reveals is two things, right? What I showed before, the increase over time on average across all firms that are listed in the market, but also the sharp increase following these periods of uncertainty. During periods of uncertainty, not surprisingly, investors and others aren't willing to necessarily bear the additional uncertainty and risk and would like the returns more short-term. And so we actually expect that uptick following those periods of enormous uncertainty. So we also would like to address what many would rightly raise, which is, well, maybe what's happening is the firms that are more longer-term oriented are simply pulling out of the public capital markets, and what we see remaining are the most short-term firms, right? So we thought, well, that's an important hypothesis to investigate. And so what we did is we then plotted the values for short-termism for every single firm in our sample over multiple time periods, right? And so on the horizontal axis that you see on this graph, what's represented is this market discounting or this short-termism measure in the early period, if you will. And then on the vertical axis, it's the later period, right? So what this means is any dot you see, which represents a single firm, right? The value of short-termism in the later period is greater than the earlier period. That means they're becoming more short-term oriented over time. Anything below the diagonal, it's the opposite, right? Firms becoming less short-term oriented over time. And then if we see anything on the diagonal, that just simply means there's really no meaningful change between periods, right? So we're plotting that. Furthermore, because we're doing these comparison time periods and because we have a very long window in our sample from 1980 to about 2020, so we chunk it up into 3 different groups of that early versus late. And so what we see is that we can also see, well, is that comparison different? Is it in different places on this diagonal line? Do we see changes in those shifts over time? So what we observe here is this. So first of all, these 3 different colors represent those 3 comparative time periods, right? So always early versus late. Blue is the earliest, yellow is the intermediate period, red is the most recent period. So first of all, you notice most of the dots, though not all, but the vast majority are above the diagonal. This means that short-termism is increasing within that comparative time period for those firms. Secondly, what we also notice is that it's increasing market-wide over time, and that's that march up the diagonal. The early period is lesser than the intermediate, which is lesser than the most recent period. So this suggests that it's not simply turnover in the public capital markets, right, that the firms are going private, right, or fewer firms are listing. These are firms that have persisted within the sample over time, and we're seeing short-termism rising for those firms. So then turning to our other key construct, which is breakthrough inventions. How do we actually measure this? Well, I'd like to give you an example, right? So imagine the overhead projector. Some of you may have seen this. Some of this may predate you, but this was the technology when I was in university, and we have overhead slides. Now we have PowerPoint. But basically, there was a technology that came out of this, which was a lens, okay? And so that lens was patented. And on the basis of that patent, other patents came along, other inventions that built on that initial lens or patent, right? And we could map them out as a generational tree, like a family tree, if you will, of inventions, right? So we have here listed all the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of this initial patent, this lens from this overhead projector. And it's in very small font, I apologize for that. But on the far right side, you'll see it spans across many different technological domains, everything from electronics to materials and adhesives to lenses, right? So one way we could capture this is just by looking at the direct children or impact, the inventions that build directly on the technology. But we're going further than that. We're actually measuring influence, as we call it, which is the whole tree, right? The whole generational tree. What has come from this initial invention, both directly and indirectly? And this is our measure for how we're calculating or capturing breakthrough inventions. Now, there's obviously the upsides of this, which is that, we get to see the richness and that this was an invention that was being built on by multiple other inventions. But the downside of this is that we need this very long time period after the initial patent to capture the children, great-grandchildren, et cetera, right? So we also use an alternative measure as robustness, which is basically what we call lexical novelty. Actually, we didn't call it, the folks who developed it did. And basically what that is a count of all of the novel words in a patent compared to other patents in the same technology class in that same year. So how different is that patent, right, for other patents in that same technology sector? That's really what we're capturing with this particular measure here. Now, it does capture novelty, but it doesn't necessarily capture value, right? We don't know necessarily as to whether or not these patents are actually built upon or valuable later. So it has its own downsides, but it gets us out of that long time window that we need to examine and allows us to look at more recent data. Okay, and that brings us directly to research design. So how are we actually testing these ideas? And so it's very simple. We're using sort of these regression statistical analyses to capture the relationship between breakthrough innovation, short-termism, and various other very important firm characteristics, right? So like how much is the firm investing in R&D, right? How much capital expenditure does the firm have? How big is the firm? How large is it, right? How much has it been patenting in the past? We're trying to control for all those other things that might also explain breakthrough inventions, right? And so that's essentially what we're trying to do here. And then in order to get at a causal relationship, so this previous one, how we typically measure it, it's really a correlation. It's really showing these two things tend to move together, but we don't know that one is causing the other, right? And that's a really important distinction. So we then try to test for this causal relationship by using a different measure of short-termism, which I alluded to before, the change in investor behavior, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we use data for this particular study is all publicly listed or traded companies on the US exchanges from 1980, actually more recently than 2017. We also use some private data on the patents just to see whether firms are shifting. It's shifting away to more private firms, et cetera. We don't find that that's the case, though I'm not reporting that here today. Our empirical approach is we have done more than hundreds, we've done thousands of regressions, and we're using a particular visual technique, which I'll explain in a moment, called an epistemic map. And the advantage of this is that it shows you the relationship between short-termism and breakthrough inventions across thousands of regressions in one graph, right? And so what that allows us is to get away from the sensitivity of any single result to specific assumptions or choices that the researcher is making, right? About which variables to include in the regression, do we vary the time lags, do we vary the empirical construction, et cetera. So we're really trying to see how robust are these results. Can we make them go away, right? If we sort of change our variables around. So that's our essential approach. And so what we find is this. So this, first of all, is one of those epistemic maps, which I just mentioned. And this is hundreds of regressions, actually thousands. And so the black line that you see is the average effect of short-termism on influential inventions. So you'll notice that that black line across the top of the graph is 0. Anything below it is negative, which means that when the average effect falls below the 0, it means that rising short-termism decreases the likelihood of more influential inventions. right? So first of all, that's that basic interpretation. Blue lines would represent just a specific model. So if you've ever seen a table of regression results, that's essentially what that would represent, one single blue line. So each of those vertical lines is a regression, right? And so these gray areas represent the confidence interval around that parameter estimate that is that black line, right? So we have 95% confidence that the effects of short-termism on influential inventions fall within that gray range, right? So that's essentially what we're doing here, okay? So what we find from this set of graphs across many different dependent variables, constructions, whether we take the average, the median, the 95th most influential patents in a firm's portfolio, is that rising short-termism has a negative impact on influential inventions. So what we want to really know is, though, does it cause it, right? So is it the rising of short-termism, or is these two things just happening at the same time, right? And we're just capturing that empirically. And so this is that instrument or alternative measure of short-termism that I've mentioned before. So what we're looking at here is the change in institutional investor blockholder behavior. And a blockholder is any firm that's holding more than 5% of the stock of that particular firm, right? So it may not sound like a lot of a stock holding, but that actually is a pretty large chunk of a large publicly listed company. And it has a lot of influence over the actions of the firm, right? It can sway stock price based on their trading behavior, et cetera. So why are we using this measure? Well, first of all, there's enormous growth in institutional holdings, right? From only 8% in 1950 to about 68% in 2006, and even more today, right? We also know, as I mentioned before, that these investors influence firm behavior. Past research shows that, when firms are essentially trying to make their earnings estimates and their institutional investors, they know are transient and are likely to trade on those shares quickly, they will cut their R&D spending to make the earnings guidance or earnings expectations. Similarly, it can change the nature and type of R&D or innovation that's coming out of a firm. Institutional owners also vary in how they trade, right? They vary in their holding period is one way, right? So transient would be very short. Okay, so lots of turnover in which firms that they're holding. Dedicated means, as the name implies, you're holding that firm for a long period of time. And then finally, these institutional owners, like how they're deciding on these time horizons, are largely unrelated to the behavior of a single firm. That's because what we're capturing is that institutional investor behavior over the entire fund, right? So they're making a change over the whole fund, not just for a specific firm. So it's unrelated to the firm characteristics itself. So it's what we would call orthogonal. And so therefore, it makes a good way of trying to capture short-termism that isn't being driven by the firm characteristics itself. So it's something outside the firm. Okay, so when we do that, and we do the same epistemic map approach, but we're using this alternate measure of short-termism, again, it's not as noted as clearly here, but the top of the graph is 0. So all of these estimates are negative. In no case does the confidence interval, that is that gray band, it never involves 0, right? So they're highly statistically significant. The magnitudes are actually quite large. And so what this implies is that as short-termism is rising within specific firms, it means that those firms are much less likely to produce influential inventions, right? Okay, so just to summarize, rising short-termism is leading to these declining influential inventions. We know that they patent less, these firms. They have less influential or novel patents. And this is robust not only to hundreds, but thousands of different specifications, right? So I'm not just cherry-picking results to report to you today. I can say with all honesty, these are the strongest empirical results I have seen in my own personal academic career for myself. So they are incredibly robust. Short-termism also has a stronger negative impact on influential inventions for certain kinds of firms, right? So it has this average effect, but it also impacts firms differently. So some firms are hurt worse than others. So if, for example, the investors are changing their behavior for firms that are engaged in these long-term, more complex R&D projects or research projects, as captured by centralized R&D, more complex technological domains, they have government funding for their R&D, they're more science-oriented, then we know it has an even greater impact in terms of dampening those influential inventions that are coming forth. So what does this mean? Why do we care about this result, or why might we care? So if short-termism is impacting the nature of R&D within firms, what other important long-term sort of investments by the firm might also be abandoned, right, with rising short-term pressures? So there are many other important investments a firm might make that have very long-term payoffs, or medium-term payoffs even. One is workforce development and benefits. So investing in your workforce, paying living wages, having good working conditions, providing training, et cetera. That has long-term benefits in terms of retention, employee engagement, right? And so that actually in the long run will be beneficial to the firm, but is a short-term cost. Development of environmentally sustainable design, manufacturing practices, right? Resilient supply chains, which is very much top of mind now as firms are revealing and understanding that their supply chains are in fact not very resilient. And then also investment in community relations and engagement with community, which will give firms social license to operate in those locations. And many firms have found that failure to make these investments can lead to loss of assets in those locations. Of course, many of us know innovation is also the fuel for firm and economic growth, right? So it is the source. Where is our future growth going to come from, right? If the vast majority of these firms are abandoning investment in long-term projects that yield influential inventions. These are the source of, future raising of all boats, right? Rising human health and well-being. And so if we're not engaged in those kinds of investments, where will that come from? And also for firms specifically, how are they going to maintain their competitive position, right? So you might get a short-term benefit from cutting expenses or cutting R&D programs, but in the medium to long term, where is your revenue going to come from? Where are your new markets going to come from? And so with that, I would like to turn it over for questions, for comments. I thank you very much again for being here today and for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation with Sir John. Thank you so much.
Right, well, thank you, Rachelle, and I think you've given us all a lot to think about. Let me start by asking, what is meant by breakthrough innovation? I mean, that phrase was in the invitation for the prize. And I think, and most people might think, that a breakthrough innovation was something like Archimedes jumping out of his bath shouting, "Eureka," or someone, and I think there's still a dispute about where it was and when it was, someone invented the wheel, and then a lot of the world was never the same again after that. Mm-hmm. But the things you're talking about are not really of that kind, are they?
Well, it would certainly include those kinds. Of course, they didn't have patents when the wheel was invented, or Archimedes jumped out of the bathtub, right? So those ideas were not patentable at the time. However, I would argue that anything that really changes the nature of how innovation or inventive activity is done within a technology sector would qualify as breakthrough. There are certainly shades of gradation of that, right? Some are more breakthrough than others, some are more important than others, some are more important to society than others. There's no question about that. But it is still capturing things that are important for our economy, for growth and human health and well-being.
Right, so that in a sense, what you mean by breakthrough innovation is an influential innovation.
Yes.
Would that be fair?
Yes, that's correct.
And yet there's something else which you framed in talking about breakthrough innovations, which I think are really quite important, which is that it's a collection of changes, not just a single one. In fact, if I go back to the way you defined it, that was really part of that definition, wasn't it?
Yes, so it's a way of thinking about how would we actually identify something that's breakthrough, right? So conceptually, it's something where you've had to make all sorts of other changes and other inventions in order to support this particular invention. I think that's what you're speaking to. Yes, so it's not an easy problem to solve. It's not reductive. It requires a different way of thinking that requires different supports and structures. And so we just have the opportunity via the data that we're using to actually see some of that as well.
And don't we do that more often collectively than within the individual firm? If I think everyone thinks of one of the defining innovations of our time as being the smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't the case that Apple developed all these things that went into the smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
It was rather people had developed a whole variety of technologies that were then collectively incorporated by Apple into a single device.
That's right. And also the individual experiences of everyone who was on those teams, where they had learned from, who they had learned from, right? Bringing those skills and talents to the firm. And so it is always a collective endeavor, right? It's just a question of how much is housed within the firm at the time that the invention is made, right? So, and oftentimes it blurs the boundaries between the public and private sector too, right? So as more and more universities are involved with firms in this process of innovative development.
Right. So this is really the development of collective intelligence, or what Joe Henrich has called that, both within the firm and across a sector as a whole, in which means that often these breakthroughs are just kind of waiting to happen. I think the laser printer is a bit like that, isn't it?
I don't know. There were many technologies that just didn't exist in that particular illustration. It was not simply a combining of things that did already exist and we just needed to bring them all into the same room. They were a discovery of, oh, if we want to do this, then this other thing has to exist, which we don't currently have, right, for the development of the laser printer. And this has been written upon extensively by like Brian Arthur, for example. And that's not just bringing together the collective, right? It is actually additional invention that has to occur.
But yet a lot of it is the bringing together of things at a point in time.
Yes.
I've always liked the example of the television, which was invented in 1926 by about 4 different people, because all the technologies you needed to create something that did that were around in 1926. It's just waiting to happen, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a ripening effect, right? That there's a time and place for certain kinds of scientific discovery, right? And that's true for things that are patentable as well as things that aren't, right? We see this in the basic sciences as well. The time was right for the solving of a certain physics problem,
Yeah.
right? Similar idea.
And equally, the idea of the smartphone was not patentable, although there were a whole range of things that went into it, mostly rather minor things, actually, that were patentable and patented.
Though one could argue that, the intellectual property lawsuit of Apple against Samsung for the design of the iPhone was exactly because they did have some intellectual property rights around it.
And that's stretching the problem we all know, that ideas in principle are not patentable, devices are, and that's a very blurred kind of line to draw. That also raises, Rachelle, the question of what we learn from this patent, from these patent databases, because patents relate to a very particular kind of innovation typically, don't they? It's very clear in pharmaceuticals, for example, what we mean by patentable innovations. But so many of the innovations that matter to us nowadays are really business process innovations.
Well, yes, and, right? So there's patents in things like, well, first of all, let me back up for a moment. Patents are more useful in some areas than others, of course, right? So you mentioned pharmaceuticals, a close cousin of that is chemicals, right? It's very difficult to change the molecule or compound without it having change in efficacy, right? In the intended result. So patents are extraordinarily effective for protecting that kind of intellectual property. It gets blurry once you start to get into electronics and things like that, where it's more easy to patent around or invent around a particular idea. And so firms in those spaces may or may not use those patents as commonly or frequently. But having said that, there are other strategic reasons that they use them. So they do tend to patent an awful lot of their inventions. And they are often not just process. They are technical in nature. They are compounds. They are designs of particular products, goods, or services.
Yes, though we know a great many of these patents are not of much merit, but are simply expensive to defend in US courts.
Some are. The electronics companies might beg to differ, right?
I'm sure they would, but it doesn't make it less true.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. So I think the broader point that patents are not going to capture all forms of innovation in an economy is an extremely important one, right? So to be clear, what we are capturing is, invention in this slice, where we can capture it with patents. We know that doesn't capture all the innovation in an economy, right? But it is something that we can capture, and we do know that they are important indicators of invention and inventive activity by firms, particularly in some sectors. One just has to be careful about generalizing to every sector of the economy based on that.
Yeah, but if we look like an industry like financial services, there's been a great deal of innovation. We might have discussion as to how useful much of the innovation has been, but there has been a great deal of innovation by any standard. And almost none of that is patentable.
Right. So some of it is, right, through these business processes, which I understand the reservations around. Some of it is clearly not. And sometimes firms choose not to patent because it gives away their intellectual property, right? It's not very defendable in the courts. So it's true, we won't capture everything in the economy, but we will capture an awful lot of it, right, in some very important sectors.
Rachelle, one of the things that intrigued me about your research is when you submitted the application in the first place, I was very skeptical about the ability to capture a quantitative measure of short-termism. Could you say a little bit more about how you did it?
Do you mean how we found it or how we actually estimated it?
I think if you could try and define it non-mathematically for the audience, it would be most helpful.
Sure. So I think we spent a long time. That work was primarily done with my co-author Yuan Shi at Cornell, and Yuan and I spent a long time reflecting on how would this be reflected in firms. Like if we could go to firms and ask them for anything we wanted and we could get it, what would we be asking for? And we decided, well, what we really want to know is what is their hurdle rate internally, their internal rate of return, which defines how they discount their investment projects inside the firm. Like, okay, well, we can't get that. What's the closest approximation, right? So then we started looking at, well, are there other ways of looking at how cash flows from a firm would be sort of discounted back? We came across the work of Andrew Haldane that I mentioned before, of him and his colleagues. That was a published paper. They had an idea about capturing short-termism in a particular way through these asset pricing models, which was built on earlier work. The estimation part of it, we have other tools and techniques that allow us to estimate that at a firm level rather than an economy-wide or industry-wide or sector level. But we also did some math, right? So we tried to figure out how does this actually relate to mathematically to a hurdle rate within the firm, right? And so we came up with a mathematical derivation of, that rising short-termism, this measure that we have, is very, very closely related to the internal firm discount rates.
And you have actually successfully calibrated in some cases against these internal hurdle rates, have you?
We haven't in those terms. So I think what we want to be careful to state about this particular measure is that there's an enormous debate, of course, in the finance world about the value of asset pricing models and how to do them well and how accurate are they, et cetera. And so the kind of calibration that we did was mainly around a couple of things, correlating it with firm-specific characteristics and decisions that they were making that had been previously found to be measures of short-termism, right? So throwing money back at investors through, say, share repurchases, things like cutting R&D or cutting capital expenditure, things of that nature. So we did a lot of validation, spent a long time validating the measure in that way. We did loads of course, robustness checks and things like that. But importantly, what we look at is we're very careful not to say this is the precise valuation of this particular firm based on this measure, but rather say this is how we can compare these two firms. This firm is more short-term than this firm, right? And then furthermore, what's happening to that firm over time. So it's the across-time comparison and the between firm and the cross-section that we take the most confidence in rather than a specific point estimate that means a certain valuation. But we do have confidence that it does align with short-termism and behavior of the firm.
So there's a broadening of the answer there that is, I think, responds to something that has intrigued me, which is, if I think of the way hurdle rates are actually applied in firms, they're pieces of statistical analysis done by rather junior people. They're not really how the board makes a decision, or even how senior management makes a decision. But perhaps what's being caught by this kind of analysis is something about the culture of the firm, so that the junior analysts use the high hurdle rate because the culture of the firm is to reject a lot of long-term projects, etc. It's that way round, as it were.
Well, so my anecdotes from this, and they are anecdotes, of course. Anecdote. Well, fair enough.
Question, really.
Absolutely. So the anecdotes that I have from this are, there are many, but that basically the hurdle rates are there as a benchmark, right? So, and many firms, it's only a necessary but not a sufficient condition for making an investment, right? So, we will not invest in anything that doesn't give us 11% because we know we have 9 other things that can give us at least that, and we're not going to waste our resources on anything less. And so therefore that becomes the base level. And yes, those calculations are made by the junior person. Now, it's a little bit of not a deflection, but an angle on what you were saying before, in that, does this reflect something about the culture of the firm? And it well could, right? So this could be some kind of omnibus measure of what's actually going on inside the firm. Now, whether it's an accurate representation of a specific hurdle rate or something like that within the firm, we don't know for sure. But what we can say is that these firms that are signaled by this measure to be more short-term do tend to behave that way, right? And so maybe that's what it's capturing.
Yeah, and I have a favorite anecdote, which is of Boeing in the 1960s, and there was supposedly a board discussion of the expenditure on developing the 747, and someone on the board asked, had there been this kind of formal analysis of expected returns, and was told there had been, but nobody could remember what the result was. And that was the story of Boeing as it then was, and we actually talked yesterday about the rather different Boeing as it became and as it was in the last decade. But perhaps that's the moment for me to open up the discussion and see what questions and observations there are from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachelle. I'm a former journalist, so forgive me if I try and reduce this to a headline. Well, I'm not going to go that far, but just trying to extrapolate your findings to a sort of the real world implications of what you've laid out. What we've heard is you talked about a decline in influential innovation, short-termism, which of course we all know has been a particular characteristic of the corporate world, especially in the US. What I hear you lay out here is something potentially quite worrying for the US economy, actually. If you bear in mind that the US economy's great strength is innovation, and has been. In fact, James Anderson and I were talking about this earlier on, Silicon Valley, and how it's driven so much economic value out of the US. If you put that together with what's happening with the technological innovation arms race between the US and China, this doesn't sound like great news, actually, for corporate America. And I noticed that your sample set was Amex, NYSE, and NASDAQ companies, listed companies, of course. You're not talking about private companies, which is a separate discussion. So if you pull all that together, this doesn't sound like great news for the US economy.
I would agree.
Good, I got the headline. Excellent.
And yeah, but let me say yes and, right? So I agree with you, and there are always exceptions, right? So there are still firms that are pursuing this, right? So what I'm reporting is the central tendencies, right? The majority tendencies within firms. There are exemplar firms. There are firms that have long-term research projects. Everybody's heard about Google X, right? And so that's their kind of moonshots division, right? They're engaged in very long-term research and development projects. The problem is that we're seeing that narrowed down to a smaller and smaller set of firms over time, right? And so then the question is, can we rely on just that smaller set of firms to generate all of our influential and path-breaking inventions going forward? And that's the big question. Or is there another ecosystem developing around influential invention that involves, say, the universities or the public sector in some other way? And so there's a lot of nuances around this. But yes, it is problematic.
Next question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, could you elaborate more on the differences between sort of an exogenous increase in or pressure in short-termism, let's say coming from your institutional investors, versus, and I get this from other research, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Graham and Harvey, who've done work to show that actually managers themselves feel like their decisions are more and more miscalibrated over time, and they can reliably plan less and less far into the future. Mm-hmm. So, in that context, what role does government support, which was in the title, have in sort of alleviating a bit of that uncertainty that may stop firms from pursuing these breakthrough innovations, or at least research into them? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So there's a number of responses to that. So governments play an important role on many levels. So of course, as regulators of the markets and what firms are required to report and the information that comes out, that obviously is incredibly important. But in terms of diminishing the pressures, so that's another question, right? So the kind of pressure that I highlighted here was just one of many, right? Which is essentially institutional investors and how they're changing their sort of trading behavior and things like that. There are many levers that governments can pull to try to encourage longer term investment behavior. One is the one that I mentioned here, which is direct investment in basic research along with firms, right? And so when governments are investing in R&D that is being conducted within firms, usually it has to be something of a nature that's going to affect many different parties, not just the firm, right? So it has to have that kind of component. That's becoming a really increasingly important part, right, of generating influential inventions. And so my work, Brent Goldfarb's work with Rafael Corredora, they've done a lot of work specifically on that, on government funding and what kinds of inventions come out of that. And that's much more influential ones. So that's a big part of it. So that funding needs to not dry up, particularly in the US. So that's one implication of that. So there have been other proposals around tax policies and encouraging people to hold stocks for longer periods of time, around capital gains and things like that. And so that's a very favorite lever in the United States for encouraging behavior, is to basically ask, or essentially offer a tax break to individuals or retail investors or institutional investors if they hold those stocks for a longer period of time. So those are just a kind of couple levers that basically can be pulled around that. There's many more things that regulators can be done, but a lot of it actually is within the firm too, and I don't want to push that aside, right? So the study that you cite is, basically CFOs, right, the financial officers within the organizations want to smooth earnings at all costs, basically, right? And there are reasons for that. And usually it has to do with compensation and cost of capital for the firms. So how firms design their executive compensation schemes is extraordinarily important to time horizons within the firm. I know that's not exogenous, what you were talking about, but it's a crucial component. And to the extent that regulators have something to say about how compensation packages are structured, there is something to do with that, right? So in fact, some of the worst problems that we have came about in the US around an act in 1992 that said basically in order to get a break on compensation that you're paying to executives over $1 million, you have to tie it to performance measures. So what did they do? They tie it to stock price. And because it's a performance measure, and that led to absolute ballooning of CEO and top executive salaries, right? And also tying to very short-term returns. So it was a well-intentioned policy, but it had these kinds of impacts. So that's another very important thing to take into account by external parties.
Next question from audience.
Thank you very much for a very innovative lecture.
Thank you.
Could you tell us the difference between, or what are the factors which drive, innovative research such as penicillin, innovative work like that, or pasteurization, and the developments which came from those, as opposed to the mobile phone, which is just an extension of concepts. Could you tell us the sort of thinking and what is required for those difference between the two?
Yes, I think that's what, Sir John, you were getting at a little bit too earlier with your comments and questions. So I am not an historian in that domain. Let me first give that big caveat. And some of my colleagues at the University of Maryland, David Kirsch and Brent Goldfarb, could speak very eloquently to that question exactly. So for me, though, so when you describe penicillin, it's accidental, right? It's an observation, right, that one makes. Gee, there's this mold growing and this particular infection is not proceeding past it. And isn't that interesting, right? So there's a lot of happenstance in some of these discoveries, right? And leaving kind of space for that to happen. What I think we can learn from that in terms of influential invention now is the somewhat expensive process of allowing space and time for exploration by researchers, right? And so that's the importance in some ways of collaborations with, say, academic departments and other parts of the economy where that exists, so that there is opportunity for experimentation without very, very tight, ties to, say, budget or specific outcomes, right? Performance metrics, if you will, for innovation. And so allowing that is really important. I agree with you that some of it is, some of the inventions we see today, it's just combining, bits and pieces across different domains. That's important too, right? Those kinds of inventions. It's just not the only kind that's important. And so just being allowed to have that space, the time, those, like I said, the sort of budgetary and time flexibility is extraordinarily important to the process of discovery.
Well, yes and no, Rachelle, because the other interesting aspect of the penicillin story is that for 10 years nothing happened.
Yeah.
Fleming discovered penicillin. He published it in an academic paper. And it was 10 years later before Florian Weitzman took up further investigation of penicillin. And then it took the Second World War to develop that, and then the whole set of antibiotics, and indeed the modern pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, absolutely. And we see other examples of that today, right? Where things just don't get picked up right away and commercialized. Sometimes their time has just not come. But I would also dare say that were that paper to be written today, that it probably would be picked up much more quickly, given our information flows and how scientists and firms are finding new ideas, right? So it probably would be different.
Sure of that. I think somehow we just then didn't have anything like a pharmaceutical industry of the kind we now imagine. It goes back to the issue about the culture of firms, doesn't it? The firms that would have made that commercial development simply didn't exist.
Yeah, you need the whole infrastructure needs to exist. Yes, absolutely.
That's a great question there.
Hello, thanks very much. It's very interesting. Just on Alexander Fleming, actually, if he had gone to work with Pfizer during the Second World War, he said he would never have been able to invent penicillin because they cleaned the Petri dishes there at the end of the day. But that wasn't what I was going to ask. The point I was going to ask was, what is the correlation between productivity, which is in a very poor state in the UK and probably elsewhere, and short-termism. Could you sort of elucidate a bit more on how we can improve productivity and how short-termism impacts poor productivity?
Boy, that's a very big question. And I'm certain I'm not going to do it justice. But let me say that it's going to depend on sector, naturally, right? Because what will improve productivity in one sector is not going to be the same as another. When we think about measuring productivity, right, that requires us to have information on how individuals are performing, right? And that's easier to observe in some sectors than others. And furthermore, it's easier to observe the inputs that are necessary to lead to that level of productivity in some sectors versus others, right? So we're going to have these sectoral differences. What I will say, at the risk of it sounding a bit soft, but is that there are investments that need to be made in the workplace on not viewing employees as pure cost centers, but as creators of value within organizations, and that are related to productivity in ways that we don't currently capture well empirically. And because of that, firms often do not make those kinds of investments. It is harder to make that case. And so what I would argue is that many individuals are, looking for not only meaning in work, but the ability to contribute meaningfully to their work, which sometimes requires, workforce development, training, and practices around that. But they also need to not live hand to mouth, right? So that they're constantly worried about the next paycheck, because we know from financial scarcity, from time scarcity, that leads to short-termism behavior, right, in individuals. That's been widely shown in the research. So it leads to tunneling. We can't take into account things in our peripheral vision, and we certainly cannot look beyond the short-term time period. So those are the things that I would suggest, at the risk, again, of not being able to back it up exclusively with hard-nosed research.
Isn't there also a question, about how effective we are at measuring the impact on productivity of innovation? If I think of some of the innovations we've been talking about in the course of this discussion, we started with the laser printer, we talked about the iPhone, we've just talked about penicillin. Mm-hmm. None of these are well measured in the way in which we construct national accounts.
And that extends well beyond the measured impact of innovation, right? It's the measured impact of environmental systems, right? The value that's created by that, and what is the cost as we take down a forest, right, to the environmental system, and the value that was created by that. We just don't do a good job with that, which means that when we are involved in decision making, the kinds of data and metrics that we have now are extraordinarily still important, but they're not everything. I think it's important to acknowledge that we are not measuring all things that matter and all things that are important, and it's difficult to capture the influence, which is not to say we shouldn't try, but to your point, we aren't capturing all of it.
We have time for, I think, 2 more questions. Do we have anything from our online audience? Carolina.
Thanks. This one comes in from William Nicol online. Rachelle, do you believe that a company's social ethos can act as both an innovation enzyme or indeed sedative?
Well, I would need to know what he meant by social ethos, but I'll take a punt. So what I would term that is perhaps the culture within a firm. And the culture within a firm is the thing that makes 10,000 decisions, right? So how a firm sets up its organizational culture defines how individuals autonomously make decisions within that organization. And so therefore, yes, right, it can work in both directions, and it is extraordinarily important. Many firms do get this. It's very hard to change a culture within an organization or design a culture within an organization, but we know that it matters a whole lot. So yes.
So, Rachelle, if you were giving advice now to firms who wanted to orientate themselves for the long term and wanted to be those more, have more influential innovation within the company. What would your be advice to them then about, what should they look to do based on your research? What kind of setup should they have? Obviously a great culture, as you said, but what would be your specific points of advice to them based on your own findings?
I think the first thing is defining what it is that they're seeking to create, right? And then in that reflection, defining as best to their ability, how would they observe that, right, along the way? And then from that, you design the structures accordingly, right? And that's everything from compensation, right, packages, and how you tie compensation to the outcomes that you're looking or seeking to observe, right, to, so these cultures and things that are developed within the organization. We also know, for example, that you want to attract the kind of patient capital that will allow you to essentially engage in these long-term projects. And how firms attract patient capital is the work of many in this room as well. But basically the language that firms and managers use in terms of trying to attract that, which means communication of clear long-term strategies for those firms, which means they need to actually be developed. So there are different levers that they can pull, but it is first deciding, what are those long-term plans? How are they meaningful? How will we capture that progress along the way? How will we communicate that effectively with our outside constituents, right? And then how will we align the incentives and create the culture within the firm to actually move towards those specific objectives?
This is about signaling then, following that on. How do you signal that you are doing all those things? I know you've talked before, when I've heard you before, about things like spend, on what percentage of spend these companies have on R&D, and whether or not they put an R&D person into the senior management suite and things like this. So are there other big signals that you think, based on your work, that you've looked at?
So as an outsider, if you were trying to evaluate this within a firm and see whether this was actually happening in a firm, so there are a number of things that I would be looking for. So obviously, if a firm has sort of a senior R&D personnel on their board of directors, this is a very strong signal that they're deeply engaged in longer term research projects. This is what we've observed in the data. It also tends to be a relatively rare event, so we don't see that in a lot of firms. We can look at R&D spending, though we find that firms are not decreasing a lot of their R&D spending. It's like how they're spending it, like what kinds of projects and things like that. So the other kinds of signals I would be looking for is how executive compensation is structured, how long-term in nature is it. I would also be looking at the language that senior executives are using when they talk to investors and the press, because that is a very strong signal of whether firms are, say, greenwashing or not, or what their actual practices are. So I'd be looking at those kinds of language signals. I'd also be looking at external signals around the firm that may suggest that there's short-term pressures on those firms. So for example, is there a lot of activist investor activity in that particular sector? And if that's the case, what happens is firms on boards in that same sector, even if they're not being targeted by that activist, will start changing their behavior to avoid being targeted by the activist, right? So I'd be looking at those kind of signals. I'd be looking at some of the things I talked about today. So of their institutional investors, what are their behavior and practices, and also maybe the volatility of the R&D spending over time, and how much do they smooth earnings, right? So because those are red flags too, like not maintaining that kind of consistency. So not just the level of spending, but the volatility of that spending, right, over time. And there are a few others, but those are the ones top of mind. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions either online or from the audience?
I think you showed a slide showing the percentage of equity in a company, in the average American company, owned by institutional investors, and I think it might have been about 60%. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a little bit dated. That might have been 2006, 2008.
Seems quite low, but
yeah, it's higher. It's definitely higher now.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on the effect of index funds or index trackers, as we call them, on short-termism or long-termism? Are they positive or negative? And also on hedge funds. I mean, you've covered activist investors, but I guess you include hedge funds and that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work out there, obviously, on hedge funds, and I haven't done that work myself, but I have looked at it in some depth. The interesting thing about hedge funds is that their holding periods are pretty short, right? So when they buy up firms, I think the average is less than 2 years holding period, and the median is even lower, right? Which means that there are few hedge funds that are actually holding for longer periods of time. The vast majority, it's less than 1 year, right? And so what does that mean? Well, that means that they certainly aren't going to have patience or time or interest in sort of longer term projects, right? And so they're not going to be engaged in that kind of investment. And again, these are averages, right? So there are certainly obviously exceptions to the rule. Some do hold for longer periods of time and have that in their strategy. But in general, that's not what's happening, okay? Index funds is another matter. It's a little tricky. There's very mixed evidence around this. Some say that it gets out of the way of management and allows them to take into account or take these longer term bets, right, on investments that are made. And then there are others that say, well, actually it's worse because, there's less engagement, things like that. And so it might not be as good. What we do know is that, with index funds, though, it's complicated because some of these big firms, through their various index funds, end up holding very large chunks of firms across their different funds, and so have more influence than you would expect just by virtue of it being an index fund. So that's a very important caveat. One index fund on its own is not going to have a significant amount of influence, but when you're looking at something like BlackRock, right, which holds a single firm across many different funds, they have extraordinary input. So then it matters a great deal how they engage and how they vote their shares, right? So are they just voting with management? Are they just voting with ISS, right, recommendations in the US and elsewhere? Or are they actually engaging and making carefully thought out decisions on how they should be voting on the various statements and proxies that are coming out, right? So they actually can have a lot of influence, primarily because of that. Also, in addition to that, what we have seen, and this isn't an index fund question per se, but through, say, like Engine Number One, who held a fairly small percentage in ExxonMobil, but yet was able to basically replace 3 board members, right? And that was because of their influence with other holders of shares of that ExxonMobil. So there is outsized influence that can happen in that way too, right? So they have opportunity, right, to make change and to help facilitate change. The question is whether they will use it.
It's counterintuitive, but I've certainly heard people in organizations like BlackRock saying, because we can't sell this index fund holding in your share, or we actually have to engage in a way that we
wouldn't otherwise.
Would not otherwise.
No, that's certainly true, right? And so that may, for some firms, lead to more stability in stock price, right? Less volatility, less turnover, especially if they're firmly in the index, right? Not on the edge of it.
And it's counterintuitive, but there may be some force in it. Well, I think we've drawn this session to an end, and I'd like, first of all, to congratulate Rachelle formally for her achievement. And we actually have a token of it to present to you in the form of this Adam Smith commemorative Panmure House.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been a delight.
I'm delighted to share with you that the winner for next year is Dr. Aravind Ganesh of the University of Calgary. And what his work will be on a crowdfunding model of funding medical research. It's a new way of thinking about research and innovation in relation to medical work. There are some pilot projects going on in that kind of area. And in what will be a kind of spirit of Adam Smith, there's a theory that this might provoke something more of a free market of ideas as against the dictation of central institutes of health and funding agencies. Well, we will see. And I hope you will join us a year from now to see whether there really is some validity in that kind of claim. So we, as well as congratulating Rachelle for what she has done, we look forward to congratulating Dr. Ganesh on what we hope we will do. I hope you'll join us next year to do that. And finally, let me say thank you again to Rachelle, to my fellow judges who are here in this room, and to all of you in the audience and online for making this such a successful event. Thank you, and goodbye.